Good afternoon, everyone. Oh, guys. Good afternoon, everyone. I know it's after lunch, so I will try to keep you entertained, and you're going to try to stay with me during this talk. So I really appreciate being here because this is a subject that's very near and dear to my heart. I recently spoke at a textile grand opening that was in MacArthur, California, where there was a family that had this beautiful independent textile mill, where they were making clothes that were soil-to-soil regenerative, meaning that they came from the soil in terms of very good grazed sheep. The wool was sheared. The clothing was made in a production chain that was completely healthy, and then those clothes are biodegradable and pull carbon out of the atmosphere in their processing instead of contribute to fossil fuel emissions and climate change. It was an honor to speak there. And that moment with Ryan Houston of Houston Textiles really represents an arc and a journey that I've been on throughout my career in climate change and food systems. So some framing things in some of the conversations that we've been having today. One thing I want to name is that disruption is messy. We've been talking about disruption and how much better it is when it comes to innovation. But in real life, disruption requires the kind of people skills that can challenge all of us. When I was working in climate change, for example, there are many climate change solutions that are very disruptive and that are backed up with a ton of data. Working at the federal level, I found out very quickly there are a lot of people that no matter how much data you throw at them, don't actually believe in climate change. So all of my disruption stuff and all of my data and all of my facts didn't really matter. Similarly, one of these interventions is putting wind and solar farms on the home of ranchers and farmers that are in the Midwest. But these ranchers and farmers didn't feel a connection to this technology that was coming onto their land, and they didn't feel like they were being valued in the process. They were used to working with their hands. They weren't used to just pulling a check from a machine that's on their land. There was a livelihood question that came up. People skills. So how do we scale in ways that are useful? This question when it comes to livelihoods and craftsmanship really brings this question of scale into a really dynamic relationship with people and communities. Sometimes craftsmanship isn't the most efficient way to produce something, but craftsmanship, artisanship is very important to people. So how do we design that into this future system we're talking about? And finally, how do we design, with all of our data and facts, around identity? Data versus story is a real thing. I'm going to talk about, the thing that everybody seems to talk about when they find out I'm an American, what just happened in our election system, where we quickly found out that stories were much more important to people than facts. That is a design problem, but it's an emotional intelligence problem. How do we deal with that when we're designing for economic development and designing for our future? So one thing when it comes to my work is that I've been doing climate change and food systems work for about a little over a decade now. And systems thinking and climate change and food systems work was very hard for me until I found out about soil. Soil for me is a hack for systems thinking when it comes to food systems. Because when you look at soil, you have to talk about carbon and the carbon cycle. You look at carbon sequestration and pulling carbon out of the atmosphere, in addition to looking at reducing carbon emissions, which then leads you into a conversation about microbes and how our gut microbiome is very similar to the microbiome of soil and how those two things connect, which then leads you into a conversation about nutrient density and food, and how if you have healthy soil, food is more nutrient dense, which means that we get more nutrients from that food because an apple ain't an apple that used to be an apple 50 years ago. when it comes to the amount of nutrients, which then leads you into a conversation about how to build soil health when it comes to animals and animal welfare, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Soil was a way to connect all of my worlds. So one thing our firm did was we looked at California as an incredible opportunity to use soil as that hack for systems thinking when it comes to the food system. But one big issue we ran into is that there were a lot of gaps when it came to this system thinking. And we wanted to connect the dots. So we interviewed a bunch of folks around California that worked at the intersection of food systems, climate change, and social equity to see what they were doing. And there were some interesting things that we found. In the Central Valley, for example, there are many, many organizations that consider themselves environmental justice organizations, which means they look at disproportionate environmental impacts on low-income people and people of color specifically. They were doing soil work, but they didn't consider the work they were doing soil work necessarily. They were working on clean water issues for their populations. Well, if you're going to improve water in a particular area, you got to look at soil. They were looking at pesticides and the incidences of miscarriages and health issues for farm workers when it comes to pesticides. If you deal with pesticides, that's improving soil. They were looking at dairy digesters being next to communities and the pollution from these digesters that's going into people's lungs and impacting their health. If you deal with dairy and you deal with cows, you're dealing with soil. So why is that particular gap important? It's important because they were missing out on money. That's what we were trying to put together. Scaling these solutions requires money. Where's that money going to come from? Well, gee, the California state government has a ton of natural resource management money that is specifically earmarked for disadvantaged communities, including money that's supposed to be going toward building healthy soils in the state of California for climate purposes. But if you don't consider your work soil work and you're not talking about it in the right way, you can't get access to that money. So one of the things that we looked at there was how connecting the dots, especially when it comes to money and resources, is vitally important. Greenhouse gas emissions and looking at reducing greenhouse gas emissions is a part of that linear economy way of thinking. Building healthy soil, I don't know how many of you have worked with agriculture and soil. There ain't nothing linear about it. Soil is the quickest way to humble yourself when looking at nature and the ecosystems. One of the reasons I call it a hack is because it's almost impossible to build healthy soil and degrade any other system. But if you work with any other thing, water, animals, et cetera, you have the possibility of degrading another system. But when I say it's not linear, it doesn't do what you want it to do. It's not going to just build in 3 years. And that's particularly important to me because we have about 60 years of topsoil left around the world. So that's something we're going to have to figure out fairly quickly. So let's expand the frame. Another paper we did was with an organization called Fibershed called Designing the Future. And we started to look at regional economies as a scale that could solve a lot of those issues I brought up in the beginning, because that's the scale that can deal with identity issues and effectively building economies. So this livelihoods versus jobs issue, it's difficult. It's very difficult. We have more slavery now than we had at the peak of the transatlantic slave trade. One of the reasons that's true, if you actually want to know more about this, there's an incredible book by Edward Baptiste, I believe, that's called The Half That Has Never Been Told, and it's about capitalism and American slavery. And one of the things it talks about is how everybody knew at the time of the American slave trade back in the day that it was bad, but it was good for their bottom lines. So they just kept pushing the impact of slavery farther and farther out to the west so that they wouldn't have to see it, while making grand proclamations on the Congress floor about how Africans were people and we shouldn't enslave them. That's the same thing that's happening today, to be clear. They weren't products of their time any more than we are when someone looks at our global economy and the way that we treat third world countries. So when it comes to livelihood versus jobs, we're going to really need to think about what we're willing to sacrifice and what we're willing to change in that bigger picture. Another thing is that natural resource management is a huge part of this conversation. We looked at how you can have businesses that build very thriving ecosystems. There's a shepherdess, for example, that has sheep, and she grazes these sheep on parklands and gets paid for wildfire prevention to do that. That's a regional business that employs a lot of people that is building the regional economy. We talked to a forester who's running into some issues with environmentalists, but only because they don't understand that he's burning trees that are invasive species that need to not be in the forests that he's working in. There's a lot of complexity there, but at a regional scale, you can deal with identity issues when it comes to being an environmentalist and just having an across-the-board no trees should be cut or burned ever, and then look at ecosystems management and the actual theory behind these things and how they go together. And I finally want to talk about bridging cultural divides. I mentioned our election and data versus story. We've got about 3,000 counties in the United States. 20 of those counties account for half of our job growth and half of our income growth in the country in the last few years. In America, we have forgotten about huge swaths of our population when it comes to economic growth. And a lot of scalable solutions don't take into account the real-time impact of how people in these communities think about jobs and their livelihood. Everyone isn't going to want a data-driven job. There are people who like to work with their hands and like to feel like they're building something, who appreciate the generational impact of craftsmanship, who are fourth-generation ranchers, who want to continue their tradition in their family. So when we talk about regional economies, we're talking about that, how the story of someone's generational livelihood and their family is more important to them than the data around climate change. And I think that's valuable. Meeting people halfway means that when we think about efficiencies and when we think about scale, we're going to have to take into account the fact that identity and story is just as important as data. And I want to conclude with the fact that that requires a mind shift on all of our parts. It's going to require us to engage our hearts and minds around our own identity and how we build. It's going to require us to acknowledge that we're in the same boat as past societies that have exploited people and land, and that our ideologies are going to have to shift in addition to our pocketbooks in a lot of cases. It's going to require hard conversations. There's a reason why this hasn't been done before. But there are ways to do it. And if we look at ourselves and confront our own personal orientations and our own personal questions around scale and identity, we can do it together. Thank you.